The water was black as ink beneath Battersea Bridge that September night in 1914. A constable's lantern swung low over the embankment, catching the pale shape that drifted against the pilings. She floated face down, her grey hair fanning out like riverweed, her arms spread wide as if she had simply surrendered to the current. Margaret Elizabeth Lofty had been a bride for precisely one day. They pulled her from the Thames before dawn, her wedding ring still gleaming on her swollen finger. The coroner would note the curious absence of struggle, the strange peace upon her features, as though she had walked willingly into that cold embrace. Her husband, a man who called himself John Lloyd, stood weeping at the mortuary, clutching the insurance papers he had purchased only hours before the ceremony. But the Thames keeps no secrets forever. Somewhere in the sodden pages of parish registers across England, other names waited to surface. Other brides, other bathtubs, other bodies pulled from water that should have been warm and safe. The river had claimed Margaret Lofty, but it was not the river that had killed her. The candle guttered, the morgue fell silent, and in the shadows of a nation at war, a monster moved unseen through the fog. Chapter 1: The Stillness. Before good evening and welcome. The night has grown quiet now, and the world outside has softened into shadow. Wherever you are listening from, whatever hour the clock has struck, let the weight of the day slip away. You are safe here. The Bedside Historian is glad of your company on this dark and winding journey through the corridors of the past. If you're new to this channel, consider subscribing and leaving a like, for such small kindnesses help these whispered histories reach other restless souls searching for stories in the night. Now then, let us settle in. Let the stillness wrap around you like a woolen blanket, and let us drift backward through the mist of years to an England that existed on the cusp of catastrophe. The year is 1910. The old Queen has been dead for nearly a decade, and her portly son Edward has followed her into the grave. A new king sits upon the throne, George V, and the empire he has inherited stretches across the globe in shades of imperial pink. But the maps tell a lie of permanence. Beneath the surface of Edwardian confidence, fault lines are spreading. In the shipyards of Belfast, a great vessel is taking shape, unsinkable, they say, destined for tragedy. In the capitals of Europe, generals are drawing up timetables for mobilization, calculating how quickly their armies can reach the frontiers. And in the modest parlours of English boarding houses, in the respectable sitting rooms of seaside towns, women of a certain age are opening their newspapers to the personal columns, searching for companionship in an age that offers them few alternatives. This is the England we must understand before we can comprehend the monster who moved through it. It was a world of rigid propriety and unspoken desperation, a world where a woman without a husband was a woman without standing, without security, without a future. Spinsters they were called, and the word carried the weight of failure. They were the unmarried daughters who nursed aging parents until the parents died. They were the widows left with small annuities and large anxieties. They were the governesses and companions who had spent their youth in service to others and now found themselves alone, their savings modest, their prospects dim. For such women, the personal advertisements in newspapers like the News of the World offered a lifeline. Lonely Hearts columns they were sometimes called, though the newspapers preferred more dignified terminology. Matrimonial introductions. Correspondence welcome from respectable parties. The advertisements were carefully worded to suggest propriety rather than desperation. Gentleman of means seeks companionship of refined lady. Widow, comfortable circumstances, would welcome correspondence with view to matrimony. Behind each carefully composed sentence lay a human being reaching out across the void of loneliness, hoping against experience that happiness might still be possible. The men who answered these advertisements were, for the most part, exactly what they claimed to be. Widowers seeking housekeepers, bachelors too shy to court women in the conventional manner, tradesmen looking for wives who might bring a small dowry to help establish a business. The system worked after a fashion. Marriages were made, Households were formed, lives continued in the quiet respectability that the age demanded. But among the lonely heart-seekers, there moved other men entirely. Men who had recognised that these columns offered access to something precious. Women with money and no one to protect them. Women whose savings might be measured in hundreds of pounds rather than thousands, but whose vulnerability was absolute. Women who wanted so desperately to believe in love that they would ignore every warning sign, every inconsistency, every whispered doubt. Women who could disappear into marriage and never be heard from again. And no one would think it strange, because that was simply what women did. They married, and then they vanished into their husbands' lives, and the world moved on without them. The boarding houses of England were the hunting grounds of such predators. These establishments occupied the middle ground between hotel and home, offering furnished rooms and meals to travellers and residents alike. They were run, almost invariably, by women. Widows often who'd converted the family home into a source of income after their husbands' deaths. Spinsters who had inherited property and needed to make it pay. These landladies prided themselves on respectability. They vetted their guests carefully. They enforced strict rules about visiting hours and noise. They noticed everything and gossiped about it freely among themselves. Yet even the most observant landlady could be deceived by a well-dressed man with pleasant manners and ready cash. The boarding house world operated on appearances. A man who paid his rent on time, who spoke politely, who kept regular hours, was a good tenant regardless of what secrets he might carry. And the nature of boarding house life meant that intimacies were impossible to monitor. Guests came and went, couples arrived claiming to be married, and who was to say they were not? The zinc bathtubs that stood in corners of bedrooms, filled laboriously with hot water carried up from the kitchen, were sites of private ritual beyond the landlady's supervision. It is into this world that we must now introduce the man who will haunt the remainder of our narrative. His name, his true name, was George Joseph Smith. But he had used so many other names over the years that even he might have struggled to remember them all. George Baker, Henry Williams, John Lloyd, Oliver George Love. The nickname represented a life discarded, a woman betrayed, a past erased. He moved through England like a ghost, leaving no trace that could connect one identity to another, one crime to the next. To look upon George Joseph Smith was to see nothing remarkable. He was of the medium height, with a thick moustache that was fashionable for the era. His eyes were pale, variously described as blue or grey, and they held a peculiar intensity when fixed upon a woman he had chosen. His voice was smooth, his manner confident without being flashy. He dressed well, but not extravagantly, presenting himself as a man of modest prosperity and respectable ambition. He could discuss antiques with apparent expertise. He could speak of property and investments in terms that suggested financial acumen. He was, in short, exactly what a lonely woman might hope to find in a matrimonial advertisement. A steady man, a reliable man, a man who could offer security and companionship in equal measure. But behind those pale eyes lay something cold and calculating. George Joseph Smith did not see women as human beings, he saw them as opportunities. Their loneliness was a weakness to be exploited. Their savings were prizes to be claimed. Their trust was a tool that, once gained, could be used to strip them of everything they possessed. He had no conscience, no capacity for remorse, no flicker of empathy for the suffering he caused. He was, in the terminology of a later age, a psychopath. But in 1910, no such word existed. Men like George Joseph Smith were simply called wicked, or cunning, or evil. The science of the mind had not yet developed the vocabulary to describe the particular emptiness that dwelt within him. His criminal career had begun early. By the age of 9, he had been sent to a reformatory in Gravesend for theft. The institution was supposed to rehabilitate young offenders, to instill discipline and morality through hard work and religious instruction. For George Smith, it served only as an education in the ways of crime and the techniques of deception. He emerged harder, colder, more convinced than ever that the world was a place where the clever preyed upon the foolish and only sentimentality prevented one from taking what one wanted. Throughout his 20s and early 30s, Smith accumulated convictions for theft, fraude, and receiving stolen goods. He served time in various prisons across England, learning with each sentence how to avoid detection, how to create false identities, how to vanish before the law could catch up with him. He married for the first time in 1898, a woman named Caroline Thornhill, and promptly set her to work as a domestic servant, collecting her wages while he spent them on his own pleasures. When she objected, he abandoned her. When she sought him out, he had her arrested for theft of goods that had never belonged to her. The marriage was his apprenticeship in the use of women, a trial run for the more elaborate schemes that would follow. By the time the new century turned, George Joseph Smith had perfected his method. He would identify a vulnerable woman through matrimonial advertisements or chance encounter. He would court her with patience and apparent devotion. He would marry her with appropriate ceremony, and then he would systematically strip her of everything she possessed before disappearing to begin the process again with a new victim. The women he left behind were too ashamed to go to the police. They had been complicit in their own ruin, they believed, foolish enough to trust a man they barely knew. They blamed themselves rather than the predator who had exploited them. But George Joseph Smith was about to evolve. The petty frauds and bigamous marriages that had sustained him thus far were becoming insufficient. He needed more money, faster, with less risk of detection. And somewhere in the dark recesses of his calculating mind, an idea was taking shape. An idea involving water, and bathtubs, and the particular vulnerability of women in that most private and defenceless of moments. The England he moved through was changing rapidly. The Edwardian summer was drawing to a close, and shadows were lengthening across the continent. In 2 years, a great ship would sink in the North Atlantic, shaking the confidence of an age that had believed in its own invincibility. In 4 years, the guns of August would begin their terrible thunder, and a generation of young men would march away to die in the mud of Flanders. The world that George Joseph Smith had known, the world of boarding houses and Lonely Hearts columns and quiet respectability, would be swept away in the deluge of war. But before that cataclysm arrived, there would be other tragedies. Smaller, quieter, easier to overlook. In the bathtubs of rented rooms across England, women would die, and the verdicts would be accidental drowning, and the newspapers would move on to other stories, and a killer would count his profits and plan his next campaign. The first of his victims was already out there, somewhere in the respectable streets of Bristol, living her quiet life, nursing her modest hopes, waiting unknowingly for the charming stranger who would sweep her off her feet and into her grave. Her name was Bessie Mundy, and her time was coming. The candle flame steadied. The room grew still, and somewhere in the distance a clock struck the hour, counting down the moments until tragedy. Chapter 2. The Man of Many Names. The story of George Joseph Smith begins in the cramped and squalid streets of Bethnal Green, in the East End of London, in the year 1872. It was a district of grinding poverty, of families crowded into single rooms, of children who learned early that survival depended upon cunning rather than virtue. The air smelled of coal smoke and horse dung and the ever-present stench of the Thames, which wound its filthy course through the heart of the city, carrying sewage and secrets in equal measure. Into this world, on the 11th of January, a boy was born to an insurance agent and his wife, and they named him George Joseph Smith. Little is known of his earliest years, for the poor leave few records of their passing. His father worked long hours for modest wages, trudging through the same mean streets, collecting pennies from families who could barely afford to bury their dead. His mother kept house in whatever cramped lodgings the family could afford, moving frequently as fortunes rose and fell. There were other children, siblings whose names have been lost to history, competitors for the meagre resources of a household, always teetering on the edge of destitution. George Joseph Smith learned early that tenderness was a luxury the poor could not afford. By the age of 9, he had already embarked upon his criminal career. The precise nature of his offence has been obscured by time, but it was serious enough to warrant his removal from the family home and his commitment to a reformatory in Gravesend. These institutions, established with the noble intention of rescuing wayward youth from lives of crime, operated according to principles that would strike a modern observer as brutal. The boys were subjected to rigid discipline, endless religious instruction, and hard physical labour designed to break their spirits and rebuild them, according to respectable patterns. They rose before dawn. They worked until exhaustion. They were beaten for the smallest infractions, and they were surrounded by other boys who had already learned that the world was a hostile place where only the ruthless survived. For George Joseph Smith, the reformatory was not a place of rehabilitation, but a finishing school for villainy. He observed how the system worked, how authority figures could be manipulated through apparent compliance, how rules could be circumvented by those clever enough to avoid detection. He learned to present a facade of obedience while harbouring contempt for those who demanded it. He studied his fellow inmates, noting which boys thrived and which were broken, analysing the characteristics that separated the predators from the prey. By the time he emerged from the institution, he had acquired an education far more valuable than reading or arithmetic. He had learned how to deceive. The years that followed were a catalogue of petty crimes and minor punishments. He stole, he swindled, he served short sentences in various prisons across England, each conviction adding to his knowledge of the criminal underworld and the techniques required to evade justice. He was not a violent criminal in those early years, preferring the subtle arts of fraud and theft to the crude brutality of robbery or assault. He understood instinctively that violence attracted attention, that it brought the full weight of the law down upon the perpetrator, that it was the resort of stupid criminals who lacked the intelligence to prosper by gentler means. It was during this period that George Joseph Smith discovered his greatest talent, the seduction of women. He was not handsome in any conventional sense, but he possessed a quality that many women found irresistible. He listened. In an age when men expected to dominate every conversation, when husbands and fathers and brothers treated female opinions as irrelevant, George Joseph Smith gave women his complete attention. He asked about their lives, their hopes, their disappointments. He remembered details they had mentioned in passing and raised them again in later conversations, demonstrating a care and consideration that seemed almost miraculous. He made women feel seen, feel valued, feel understood. And he did it all with calculated precision, deploying empathy as a weapon to achieve his own ends. In 1898, at the age of 26, he married for the first time. Her name was Caroline Thornhill, and she was a bootmaker's daughter from Leicester, respectable enough in her origins, but sufficiently naive to be swept off her feet by a charming stranger. The courtship was swift, the wedding modest, and the disillusionment almost immediate. George Smith had not married Caroline for love, nor even for whatever small dowry she might have brought. He had married her because he needed a servant, someone to work while he enjoyed the proceeds of her labour. Within weeks of the wedding, Caroline found herself employed as a domestic servant in various households across London and the south coast. Her wages, such as they were, went directly to her husband. She cleaned other people's houses, scrubbed other people's floors, emptied other people's chamber pots, and at the end of each week handed over every penny she had earned to a man who contributed nothing to their household except demands and criticism. When she protested, he turned cold. When she threatened to leave, he reminded her that a wife's property belonged to her husband under law, that she had no rights he was bound to respect, that she should be grateful he had married her at all. The marriage, such as it was, lasted 2 years. During that time, George Smith refined the techniques he would employ against future victims. He isolated Caroline from her family and friends, cutting off the support networks that might have helped her escape. He alternated between cruelty and kindness, keeping her perpetually off balance, never certain whether she would face the charming suitor who had won her heart, or the cold manipulator who had replaced him. He controlled every aspect of her existence, from the clothes she wore to the food she ate to the thoughts she was permitted to express. It was a masterclass in domestic tyranny, conducted with the same methodical precision he would later bring to murder. The end came in 1900, when Caroline finally found the courage to flee. She returned to her family in Leicester, hoping to rebuild the life her husband had systematically destroyed. But George Smith was not finished with her. In a display of vindictiveness that revealed the true depths of his malevolence, he reported her to the police for stealing clothes and other items that he himself had given her. Caroline was arrested, tried and convicted. She served a prison sentence for the crime of escaping an abusive husband with the possession she had earned through her own labour. George Smith, meanwhile, walked free, his reputation intact, his methods proven, his appetite for exploitation merely whetted. The years between 1900 and 1908 remained somewhat obscure, a period when George Joseph Smith moved through England under various assumed names, leaving a trail of defrauded women in his wake. The pattern was always the same. He would identify a vulnerable target, usually through matrimonial advertisements or chance encounters in boarding houses and seaside resorts. He would court her with patience and apparent devotion, presenting himself as a respectable businessman or tradesman of modest means. He would propose marriage, often within weeks of their first meeting, playing upon the desperation of women who feared they might never receive another offer. And once the wedding had taken place, he would systematically strip his bride of everything she possessed. The techniques varied according to circumstance. Sometimes he simply absconded with whatever cash and valuables he could carry, disappearing before his wife realized what had happened. Sometimes he used more elaborate methods, persuading his victims to sign over property or withdraw savings from banks, spinning tales of investment opportunities or business emergencies that required immediate capital. Sometimes he abandoned women in foreign cities, stranding them without money or resources, forcing them to find their own way home while he vanished with their possessions. The common thread was his utter indifference to the suffering he caused. These women were not human beings to him. They were marks, targets, sources of income to be exploited and discarded. By 1908, George Joseph Smith had perfected the art of the matrimonial swindle. He could read a woman within minutes of meeting her, assessing her vulnerability, her resources, her likelihood of going to the police if things went wrong. He knew which lies worked best, which personas attracted the most profitable victims, which towns offered the richest hunting grounds. He had developed an almost supernatural ability to inspire trust, to make women believe that he was different from other men, that his intentions were honourable, that his love was genuine. He was, in his own dark way, a genius of manipulation. But genius, even criminal genius, is never satisfied with past achievements. George Joseph Smith had grown wealthy by the standards of the swindler's trade, but he remained a small-time operator, always one step ahead of the law, always looking over his shoulder for the angry husband or suspicious policeman who might bring his career to an end. He needed a bigger score, a method that would yield greater profits with less risk of detection. And somewhere in the recesses of his calculating mind, an idea was beginning to take shape. He had noticed over the years how easily women died. Childbirth carried them off by the thousands. Consumption claimed them in their youth. Influenza swept through boarding houses, killing the weak and the elderly with democratic impartiality. And drowning, too, was remarkably common. Women fainted in their baths and slipped beneath the water. They suffered fits and seizures that left them helpless. They died quietly, privately, in the one place where no one could observe them, and the coroners recorded verdicts of accidental death, and the insurance companies paid out their policies, and life went on. Insurance, that was the key. A wife was valuable not merely for what she possessed, but for what she was worth. Dead. Life insurance policies were readily available, cheaply purchased, and routinely paid without investigation. A man who married a woman, insured her life, and then arranged for her accidental death could collect hundreds of pounds without ever having to explain what had happened to the money she had brought to the marriage. It was almost too simple, almost too perfect. George Joseph Smith began to plan. He would need to find the right victim, a woman with enough money to make the scheme worthwhile, but not enough family or friends to ask awkward questions. He would need to establish himself as a devoted husband, above suspicion when tragedy struck. He would need to arrange the death in such a way that no one could prove it was anything other than a terrible accident, and he would need to do it all without leaving any trace that could connect him to previous crimes or future victims. The man of many names was about to add a new title to his collection. He was about to become a murderer. The fog was rolling in from the Thames. The gas lamps flickered in their brackets, and somewhere in England, a woman named Bessie Mundy was about to place a matrimonial advertisement that would seal her fate. Chapter 3: The First Bride. Bessie Mundy was not the sort of woman who expected romance. She had passed her 33rd birthday in the summer of 1910, an age that marked her, in the cruel calculus of the era, as a confirmed spinster. The bloom of youth had faded. The prospects of marriage had dimmed with each passing year. She lived a quiet life in Weymouth, on the Dorset coast, supported by a modest inheritance that her father had left in trust, payable in small monthly instalments that kept her respectable but never comfortable. She was plain in appearance, gentle in disposition, and desperately, achingly lonely. Her full name was Beatrice Constance Annie Mundy, though everyone called her Bessie. She had been born into the comfortable middle classes, the daughter of a bank manager who had provided well for his family during his lifetime and made careful arrangements for their security after his death. The trust he had established ensured that Bessie would never starve, but it also ensured that she would never prosper. The monthly payments were enough to rent modest lodgings and keep herself fed and clothed, but not enough to attract the sort of suitor who might elevate her to a higher station. She was caught in a peculiar limbo, too genteel to work, too poor to marry well, too proud to complain about her circumstances. The boarding houses of the English coast were filled with women like Bessie Mundy. They moved from town to town following the seasons, seeking sunshine in winter and sea breezes in summer. They took their meals in communal dining rooms, exchanging pleasantries with fellow lodgers, discussing the weather and the quality of the food and the scandalous behaviour of neighbours. They attended church on Sundays, joined lending libraries, took constitutionals along the promenade. They lived lives of almost unbearable monotony, watching the years slip past like waves retreating from the shore, waiting for something to happen, anything to break the endless routine of genteel poverty. It was in Clifton, a prosperous suburb of Bristol, that Bessie Mundy's fate found her. She had come to visit relatives in the summer of 1910, a holiday that offered temporary relief from the loneliness of her Weymouth lodgings. The city was pleasant enough, with its elegant crescents and suspension bridge spanning the Avon Gorge, but Bessie had not come for the scenery. She had come because she had nowhere else to go, no one else to visit, nothing else to fill the empty days that stretched before her ear like an accusation. She was walking along the promenade when she encountered him. He introduced himself as Henry Williams, a man of independent means who dealt in antiques and pictures. He was well-dressed, well-spoken, with a thick moustache and pale eyes that seemed to see directly into her soul. He tipped his hat. He inquired after her health. He asked if she was enjoying her visit to Clifton, and within minutes, Bessie Mundy felt something she had not felt in years. She felt noticed. She felt interesting. She felt alive. The courtship that followed was swift by any standard, but Bessie was in no position to observe proprieties. Henry Williams called upon her daily. He took her to tea shops and picture galleries. He listened with apparent fascination as she described her life, her family, her hopes and disappointments. He shared stories of his own travels, his business ventures, his search for a companion who could appreciate the finer things in life. He never pressed for physical intimacy, never made improper suggestions, never gave her reason to doubt his honourable intentions. He was, in every visible respect, a perfect gentleman. Within weeks, he proposed marriage. Bessie accepted with a joy that bordered on disbelief. She wrote to her relatives with the happy news. She made arrangements to withdraw what funds she could from her trust to establish their new household. She allowed herself, for the first time in her adult life, to imagine a future that contained something other than loneliness and regret. She was going to be married. She was going to be a wife. She was going to have a home of her own, a husband who adored her, a life worth living at last. They married on the 26th of August 1910 in a registry office in Weymouth. The ceremony was brief, the witnesses strangers recruited from the street, the celebration non-existent. But Bessie did not mind. She had what she wanted. She had a husband who loved her. Everything else was merely detail. The disillusionment began almost immediately. On their wedding night, Henry Williams revealed that he had discovered something troubling about his new bride. Her bank book, which she had trustingly shared with him, showed that she had a substantial sum available in addition to her monthly trust payments. He demanded to know why she had concealed this from him. He accused her of deception, of entering the marriage under false pretenses, of treating him like a fool. Bessie, bewildered and frightened, tried to explain that she had simply forgotten about the money, that it had been sitting in the account for so long she no longer thought of it as hers. But Henry was not appeased. His anger was cold, calculated, terrifying in its intensity. The next morning, Bessie Mundy woke to discover that her husband had vanished. He had taken with him everything of value she possessed: her jewellery, her cash, her bank book, her wedding ring. He had left behind only a note, accusing her of infecting him with a disease she did not have, claiming that her deception had destroyed any possibility of their marriage continuing. She was alone again, but now she was also ruined. She had given herself to a man who had used her and discarded her like refuse. She had no money, no possessions, no reputation. She had only shame, and the horrible knowledge that she had brought this catastrophe upon herself. For 18 months, Bessie Mundy lived in a fog of despair. She returned to her boarding house existence, surviving on her trust income, telling no one what had happened. The shame was too great to share. She had been a fool, and fools deserved their fate. She stopped attending social functions. She withdrew from the few friendships she had maintained. She existed rather than lived, going through the motions of daily existence without hope or purpose. And then, in March of 1912, she saw him again. She was walking along the seafront at Weston-super-Mare when a familiar figure approached. It was Henry Williams, her husband, the man who had robbed her and abandoned her and left her to suffer alone. He looked exactly as she remembered him. The moustache, the pale eyes, the confident bearing of a man who expected the world to bend to his will. And incredibly, impossibly, he smiled at her as though nothing had happened. What followed was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Bessie Mundy's tragic story. Henry Williams apologised. He wept. He begged her forgiveness. He explained that he had been suffering from terrible headaches at the time of their marriage, that the pain had driven him temporarily insane, that he had not been responsible for his actions. He had spent the intervening months seeking treatment, recovering his health, searching for her so that he might make amends. He loved her still. He had always loved her. He wanted nothing more than to resume their marriage and spend the rest of his life proving his devotion. Bessie believed him. This fact strains credulity, but it must be understood in the context of her circumstances. She was 40 years old, alone, with no prospects and no hope. The man standing before her represented her only chance at the life she had always wanted. To reject him was to condemn herself to decades more of loneliness and regret. To accept him was to risk further betrayal, but it was also to embrace the possibility that love might still be possible, that happiness might still be within reach. She chose to believe, she chose to hope, she chose to trust the man who had already proven himself unworthy of trust. They reunited, they resumed their marriage, and Henry Williams began to plan his wife's death. The preparations were meticulous. In May of 1912, Henry took Bessie to a solicitor in Weston-super-Mare and had her make a will leaving everything to him. He explained that it was simply a sensible precaution, that married couples should always have their affairs in order, that he had made a similar will in her favour. Bessie signed without hesitation. She trusted her husband completely now. The past was forgotten. The future was bright. In July, they moved to the seaside town of Herne Bay on the Kent coast. Henry explained that he had business interests in the area, that the sea air would be good for Bessie's health, that they would establish themselves properly, and build the life they had always wanted. They rented a house on the high street, a modest but respectable dwelling that suited their needs, and Henry Williams made a peculiar purchase. He bought a bathtub. This was unusual because the house they had rented already had facilities for bathing. The landlady had made arrangements for her tenants to use a hip bath, the standard equipment of the era. But Henry insisted that his wife deserved better. He wanted a proper bathtub, full length, large enough to immerse oneself completely. He found one at an ironmonger's shop, a cheap zinc affair that cost only a few shillings. He had it delivered to the house and installed in an upstairs room. Bessie was touched by his thoughtfulness. Her husband wanted her to be comfortable. Her husband cared about her happiness. Her husband loved her. On the 9th of July, Henry Williams took his wife to see a local doctor. He explained that Bessie had been suffering from fits, sudden seizures that left her unconscious and helpless. The doctor examined her and found nothing wrong, but Henry was insistent. His wife needed medication, needed monitoring, needed professional attention. The doctor prescribed a mild sedative and made a note in his records. If anything should happen to Mrs. Williams, there would be a medical explanation ready to hand. 4 days later, on the 13th of July 1912, a Saturday morning, Henry Williams walked into the doctor's surgery in a state of apparent agitation. He announced that he had terrible news. His wife had suffered a fit while taking a bath. He had found her submerged in the water, beyond help. She was dead. The doctor accompanied Henry back to the house on the high street. There, in the upstairs room, they found Bessie Mundy's body still in the bathtub, where her husband claimed to have discovered her. She was lying on her back, her head beneath the water, her legs extended, her arms floating at her sides. There were no signs of struggle, no bruises, no marks of violence. She looked, the doctor observed, almost peaceful, as though she had simply fallen asleep and slipped beneath the surface. The inquest was held 3 days later. Henry Williams testified that he had gone out that morning to purchase some fish for his wife's breakfast. When he returned, he found her dead in her bath. He was overcome with grief, barely able to speak through his tears. The doctor testified about Bessie's alleged fits, the medication he had prescribed, the fragile state of her health. The coroner recorded a verdict of accidental death by misadventure. There was no suspicion of foul play. There was no investigation. There was only a grieving widower and a tragic accident and a life insurance policy waiting to be claimed. Henry Williams collected £138 from the insurance company. He collected a further £2,500 from Bessie's estate, the full value of the trust her father had established to protect her. He sold the bathtub back to the ironmonger, explaining that he had no further use for it, that it held too many painful memories, and then he disappeared, leaving Herne Bay behind forever, taking with him the profits of his first murder. Bessie Mundy was buried in a pauper's grave, her final resting place unmarked, her death unmourned except by the husband who had killed her. She had trusted too much, hoped too much, believed too much, and in the end her faith in human goodness had drowned her, as surely as the water that filled her lungs. The man who had called himself Henry Williams moved on to other towns, other names, other victims. The pattern had been established. The method had been proven. And somewhere in England, another lonely woman was about to answer an advertisement that would lead her to her death. The bathwater had gone cold. The house on the high street stood empty, and the killer counted his money in the darkness, already planning his next campaign. Chapter 4. The Bath at Herne Bay. The house stood on the high street of Herne Bay, a narrow 3-storey dwelling wedged between a grocer's shop and a milliner's establishment. It was the sort of house that respectable working people rented when they wished to enjoy the sea air without the expense of a proper hotel. The rooms were small but clean. The furnishings were modest but adequate. The landlady, a widow named Mrs. Sarah Milgate, took pride in maintaining standards appropriate to the genteel classes who favoured her establishment. She had no reason to suspect that her newest tenants would bring tragedy through her door. They had arrived in early July, a married couple who gave their names as Mr. and Mrs. Henry Williams. The husband was a pleasant enough gentleman. well-spoken and attentive to his wife's needs. The wife was a plain, quiet woman in her early 40s, somewhat nervous in her manner, but clearly devoted to her spouse. They paid their rent promptly and caused no disturbances. They were, by all appearances, exactly what they claimed to be, a respectable couple seeking a holiday by the sea. The bathtub arrived on the 5th of July. Mrs. Millgate thought it an odd purchase, given that she had already provided facilities for bathing, but Mr. Williams explained that his wife suffered from a delicate constitution and required a proper tub for her health. He was most particular about the installation, supervising every detail, ensuring that the tub was positioned exactly as he wished in the small upstairs room that served as their private quarters. The landlady saw no harm in the arrangement. If Mr. Williams wished to indulge his wife's preferences, that was his affair. The tub itself was a simple affair, manufactured from galvanized zinc, approximately 5 feet long and 2 feet wide. It was a standard model of the type found in ironmongers' shops throughout England, designed for use in homes without modern plumbing. Water had to be heated on the stove and carried upstairs in buckets, a laborious process that meant baths were typically taken no more than once or twice per week. The tub was portable, meant to be stored when not in use, but Mr. Williams had it placed permanently in the corner of the room, a curious arrangement that suggested frequent bathing. What Mrs. Millgate did not know, could not have known, was that George Joseph Smith had spent considerable time thinking about bathtubs. He had pondered the physics of drowning, the mechanics of submersion, the particular vulnerabilities of a body immersed in water. He understood that a person who slipped beneath the surface in a full-length tub would struggle to regain their footing, especially if taken by surprise. He understood that the reflexive gasp that accompanied sudden submersion would draw water into the lungs, initiating a cascade of physiological responses that could render a victim unconscious within seconds. He understood that a woman in a bathtub, naked and defenseless, was utterly at the mercy of anyone who chose to exploit her vulnerability. The question that would later occupy the finest minds in forensic science was deceptively simple. How does one drown a healthy adult woman without leaving any evidence of violence? The answer, as George Joseph Smith had worked out through careful reasoning, lay in the element of surprise and the peculiar properties of human physiology. When a person's face is suddenly submerged in water, several things happen in rapid succession. The shock of the water triggers what is known as the diving reflex, a primitive response inherited from aquatic ancestors that causes the heart rate to slow dramatically. Simultaneously, water entering the nose and mouth triggers an involuntary gasp, drawing liquid into the airways. The combination of cardiac suppression and fluid aspiration can render a victim unconscious within 10 to 20 seconds, far too quickly for effective resistance. If the victim is held beneath the surface until breathing ceases entirely, death follows within minutes, leaving no marks, no bruises, no evidence of the violence that has occurred. The key to the method was speed and surprise. A woman lying in a bathtub, relaxed, perhaps drowsy from the warm water, would be completely unprepared for an attack. If her legs were seized and lifted suddenly, her body would slide down the inclined back of the tub, plunging her head beneath the surface before she could react. The instinctive attempt to sit up would be futile against the leverage advantage of an attacker holding her legs aloft. Within moments, unconsciousness would claim her, and within minutes, she would be dead. George Joseph Smith, who was calling himself Henry Williams during his time in Herne Bay, had thought through every detail. He had taken Bessie to the doctor and planted the story of her fits, establishing a medical explanation for sudden collapse. He had purchased the bathtub and installed it in their room, ensuring that no other witnesses would be present when the moment came. He had taken out insurance on her life, modest enough to avoid suspicion but sufficient to add to the substantial inheritance he would claim. He had made her write a will, leaving everything to him. Every piece was in place, every contingency was accounted for. All that remained was the act itself. The morning of July 13th dawned warm and bright over Herne Bay. The sea was calm, the sky clear, the town beginning to stir with the activities of a Saturday in high summer. Visitors strolled along the promenade. Shopkeepers arranged their displays. Children ran laughing toward the beach, trailing buckets and spades behind them. It was a day like any other day, unremarkable in every way, giving no sign that murder was about to be committed in a house on the high street. Bessie Williams rose early that morning, as was her habit. She was happy, perhaps happier than she had been in years. Her husband had been attentive and kind throughout their stay in Herne Bay. He had taken her for walks along the shore. He had bought her small gifts. He had told her repeatedly how much he loved her, how grateful he was that they had found each other again, how bright their future would be. She had no reason to doubt him. She had no reason to fear him. She had no reason to suspect that the man who slept beside her each night had already planned her death down to the smallest detail. She decided to take a bath that morning. The weather was warm, and the exertion of the previous day's activities had left her feeling dusty and uncomfortable. Her husband encouraged the idea. He would go out, he said, and purchase some fish for their breakfast. She should take her time, enjoy her bath, relax in the warm water. He would return shortly with provisions for a lovely meal. It was the last conversation they would ever have. The water was drawn and heated. Bessie undressed and lowered herself into the tub, feeling the warmth embrace her tired body. The zinc was cool against her back, but the water was pleasant, soothing the aches and tensions of middle age. She lay back, letting her thoughts drift, savouring the peace of the moment. Outside she could hear the sounds of the town going about its business. Inside there was only silence, and the gentle lap of water against the sides of the tub. She did not hear her husband return. She did not hear him climb the stairs with deliberate stealth. She did not hear him enter the room and close the door behind him. The first warning she had was the sensation of hands gripping her ankles, strong hands, implacable hands, lifting her legs out of the water with sudden, terrifying force. Her body slid down the inclined back of the tub. Her head plunged beneath the surface. Water flooded her nose and mouth as she gasped in shock and terror. She tried to sit up, tried to push herself above the waterline, but the leverage was impossible. Her legs were held high, her body bent at an unnatural angle, her arms flailing uselessly against the slippery zinc sides of the tub. She could not scream. She could not breathe. She could only struggle as the water filled her lungs and the world went dark around her. It was over in less than a minute. George Joseph Smith held his wife's legs aloft until her thrashing ceased, until her body went limp, until the last bubbles stopped rising from her submerged face. Then he lowered her gently back into the water, arranging her limbs in a position consistent with accidental drowning. He checked her pulse to ensure she was truly dead. He straightened his clothing. He composed his features into an expression of appropriate shock and grief. And then he walked calmly out of the house, down the high street, and into the doctor's surgery to report that his wife had suffered a fatal fit in her bath. The performance that followed was masterful in its execution. George Joseph Smith wept. He trembled. He could barely speak through his apparent anguish. He led the doctor back to the house and stood aside, a picture of devastated grief, as the medical man examined the body. He answered questions in a broken voice, describing how he had returned from his errand to find his wife submerged, how he had pulled her from the water and attempted to revive her, how he had realized with horror that she was beyond help. He was, to all appearances, a husband shattered by sudden loss. The doctor found nothing suspicious. The body showed no signs of violence. The death was consistent with the fits that Mr. Williams had reported during an earlier consultation. The warm water of the bath might have triggered a seizure, causing Mrs. Williams to lose consciousness and slip beneath the surface. It was a tragic accident, nothing more. These things happened. The coroner would undoubtedly reach the same conclusion. And so he did. The inquest was held on the 16th of July, 3 days after Bessie's death. George Joseph Smith testified with convincing grief, his voice breaking at appropriate moments, his eyes glistening with tears that seemed entirely genuine. The doctor testified about the deceased's medical history, the fits, the treatment he had prescribed. The coroner heard the evidence, considered the facts, and rendered his verdict: accidental death by the misadventure. There would be no further investigation. There would be no charges. There would be no justice for Bessie Mundy. The funeral was held the following day, a modest affair attended only by the grieving widower and a handful of curious onlookers. Bessie was buried in the cemetery at Herne Bay, her grave unmarked, her death unmourned by anyone who had truly known her. The trust fund her father had established passed to her husband, as did the proceeds of the life insurance policy George Joseph Smith had so thoughtfully purchased. In total, he collected nearly £2,700, a fortune by the standards of the day, more than enough to sustain him for years to come. Before leaving Herne Bay, George Joseph Smith made one final transaction. He returned to the ironmonger's shop where he had purchased the bathtub and asked if they would buy it back. The tub was in perfect condition, he explained, barely used. He had no further need of it, and the sight of it brought back too many painful memories. The ironmonger agreed to take it off his hands for a modest sum. The instrument of murder returned to the shop shelf, ready to be sold again to some unsuspecting customer who would never know the horror it had witnessed. George Joseph Smith departed Herne Bay and vanished into the anonymous vastness of England. He had committed the perfect crime. He had murdered his wife in a manner that left no evidence, that aroused no suspicion, that was certified as accidental by the very authorities whose job it was to detect such villainy. He'd gotten away with it completely. But perfection, once achieved, demands repetition. The method had worked. The profit had been substantial. The risk had been minimal. Why should he not do it again? Somewhere in England, another lonely woman was placing a matrimonial advertisement. Another victim was preparing to meet her fate, and the man of many names was already composing his reply, already planning his approach, already calculating how much he might be worth dead. The waters of Herne Bay lapped quietly against the shore. The house on the high street stood silent, its terrible secret undiscovered, and in a cheap zinc bathtub, now returned to the ironmonger's inventory, the ghost of Bessie Mundy waited for company. Chapter 5. The Second Drowning. 13 months passed. The seasons turned their slow wheel over England, summer fading to autumn, autumn surrendering to winter, winter yielding reluctantly to spring. The world moved on with its concerns, its small dramas and large anxieties, its wars rumoured and revolutions feared. In the Balkans, nations clashed and empires trembled. In the shipyards of Belfast, the great Titanic had already made her maiden voyage and met her fate, taking 1,500 souls to the bottom of the Atlantic. The certainties of the Edwardian age were crumbling, though few yet recognised the signs. And through it all, George Joseph Smith moved like a shadow across the English landscape, patient, watchful, waiting for his next opportunity. He had been careful after Herne Bay. The money from Bessie Mundy's estate had been substantial enough to allow him leisure, time to let the dust settle, time to establish new identities in new towns where no one knew his face or his history. He travelled under various names, staying in boarding houses, frequenting seaside resorts, always watching, always assessing the women he encountered. He was in no hurry. The method had proven itself. When the right victim presented herself, he would be ready. Her name was Alice Burnham, and she was everything Bessie Mundy had not been. Where Bessie had been plain and timid, Alice was robust and confident. Where Bessie had been a spinster resigned to loneliness, Alice was a trained nurse with professional standing and independent means. She was 25 years old in the autumn of 1913, young by the standards of matrimonial desperation, with a full figure, a pleasant face and a disposition that her family described as strong-willed. She should have been exactly the wrong target for a predator like George Joseph Smith. She was too young, too capable, too likely to fight back. But she had one weakness that negated all her strengths. She was in love. Alice had met the man who called himself George Smith in the seaside town of Southsea, near Portsmouth, in October of 1913. The precise circumstances of their meeting have been lost to history, but the pattern was surely familiar. A chance encounter, a pleasant conversation, an exchange of addresses. Within weeks, they were corresponding regularly. Within a month, George Smith had proposed marriage. Within 6 weeks of their first meeting, Alice Burnham had accepted over the vehement objections of her family. Her father, Charles Burnham, was a retired coal merchant who lived in Aston Clinton, a village in Buckinghamshire. He was a practical man, cautious by nature, and something about his daughter's suitor troubled him from the first. George Smith was too smooth, too eager, too vague about his background and prospects. When Charles Burnham made inquiries, he discovered that Smith's stories did not hold together. The antique dealing business was difficult to verify, the references were suspiciously circular. The man himself seemed to have no past that could be independently confirmed. Charles Burnham confronted his daughter with his concerns. Alice dismissed them as the worries of an overprotective father. She was in love. She had found a man who appreciated her, who treated her as an equal, who promised her a future of companionship and security. She would not allow her father's suspicions to destroy her happiness. The argument that followed was bitter and prolonged. In the end, Alice announced that she would marry George Smith with or without her father's blessing, and that if he could not support her decision, she would sever all contact with her family. The wedding took place on the 4th of November 1913 in Portsmouth. Charles Burnham did not attend. He had written to his daughter one final time, begging her to reconsider, warning her that something was deeply wrong with the man she had chosen. Alice did not reply. She was Mrs. George Smith now, and her loyalty belonged to her husband. Her father's warnings were nothing but the jealous mutterings of an old man who could not bear to let his daughter go. George Joseph Smith wasted no time in securing his investment. Within days of the wedding, he had persuaded Alice to sign over her savings, some £104, for what he described as a joint business venture. He had also taken out a life insurance policy on her, worth £500, payable to himself in the event of her death. The premium was modest. The paperwork was routine. No one at the insurance company thought to question why a healthy 25-year-old woman might need such coverage, or why her husband of less than a week was so eager to obtain it. On the 10th of December 1913, George and Alice Smith arrived in Blackpool. The great resort town was quiet in winter, its famous promenade windswept and largely deserted, its pleasure palaces shuttered until the return of summer crowds. They took lodgings at a boarding house on Cocker Street, run by a Mrs. Margaret Crossley, a respectable establishment that catered to visitors seeking the supposed health benefits of winter sea air. The room they rented was modest but comfortable, equipped with a gas fire, and, crucially, a cast-iron bathtub in a small adjoining bathroom. Mrs. Crossley would later remember the Smiths as an unremarkable couple. The husband was polite, but not particularly friendly. The wife seemed healthy and cheerful, if perhaps a little quiet. They kept to themselves, took their meals in their room, and caused no disturbances. They were, by all appearances, simply another married couple enjoying a winter holiday by the sea. On the morning of December the 12th, their third day in Blackpool, George Smith took his wife to see a local doctor. He explained that Alice had been suffering from headaches, severe headaches that left her dizzy and disoriented. The doctor, a man named George Billing, examined Mrs. Smith and found nothing obviously wrong, but prescribed a mild sedative and advised rest. It was a familiar pattern, though Dr. Billing had no way of knowing it. The groundwork was being laid for another accidental death. That same evening, Alice Smith wrote a letter to her father. It was the first communication she had sent since their argument before the wedding, and its tone suggested reconciliation. She wrote of her happiness, her contentment, her hopes for the future. She asked after her family and expressed a wish to visit soon. The letter was warm and loving, the words of a daughter who had perhaps begun to regret the breach with her father. Charles Burnham received it 2 days later. By then his daughter was already dead. The night of December 12th was cold and wet, typical weather for Blackpool in winter. Rain lashed against the windows of the boarding house. The wind howled off the Irish Sea. Inside, the guests retired early, seeking warmth beneath heavy blankets, listening to the storm rage outside. George and Alice Smith were no exception. They ate a light supper in their room and prepared for bed. and at some point during the evening Alice announced that she wished to take a bath. What happened next can only be reconstructed from the evidence presented at trial and the testimony of those who witnessed its aftermath. At approximately 8 o'clock in the evening, Mrs. Crossley, the landlady, was in her kitchen when she heard a sound from upstairs. It was a splashing noise, she would later testify, followed by a slapping sound, as if someone were striking the water with their hands. Then silence. A few minutes later, she heard someone playing the harmonium in the Smiths' sitting room. The tune was a hymn, "Nearer, My God, to Thee," played softly, almost meditatively. She thought nothing of it. Guests were entitled to their evening entertainments. At 8:30, George Smith appeared in the kitchen. He was carrying 2 eggs, which he asked Mrs. Crossley to prepare for his wife's supper. His manner was calm, unhurried, entirely normal. Mrs. Crossley boiled the eggs and gave them to him. He returned upstairs. A few minutes later, she heard him cry out. His voice was loud, anguished, desperate. He was calling for help. His wife, he shouted, had fainted in her bath. Mrs. Crossley rushed upstairs to find George Smith kneeling beside the bathtub, his wife's lifeless body still submerged in the water. He was attempting to pull her out, he said, but she was too heavy, too slippery, too far gone. Mrs. Crossley helped him lift Alice from the tub and lay her on the floor. Her skin was cold, her lips were blue, her eyes stared sightlessly at the ceiling. She was beyond help, beyond hope, beyond anything but the final offices that the living perform for the dead. Dr. Billing was summoned and arrived within the hour. He examined the body and found no signs of violence, no marks of struggle, no indication of anything other than a tragic accident. Mrs. Smith had suffered from headaches, he recalled. She had been prescribed a sedative. Perhaps she had fainted in the bath, struck her head, slipped beneath the water before she could recover. It was a terrible tragedy, but not an inexplicable one. These things happened. The warm water, the enclosed space, the relaxation of bathing all combined to create conditions where a sudden loss of consciousness could prove fatal. The inquest was held 3 days later, on December 15th. George Smith testified with appropriate grief, describing how he had found his wife submerged in the bath, how he had tried desperately to revive her, how he had realized with horror that she was dead. Dr. Billing testified about Alice's medical history, the headaches, the sedative, the possibility of sudden collapse. The coroner heard the evidence, considered the circumstances, and rendered his verdict. Accidental death. There would be no further investigation. The case was closed. George Joseph Smith collected his insurance money and departed Blackpool, leaving behind a grieving landlady, a puzzled doctor, and a body that would be buried in a pauper's grave. He had done it again. He had murdered a woman in her bath and escaped without suspicion. The method was foolproof. The profits were excellent. There was no reason to stop. But far away in Aston Clinton, Charles Burnham was reading the news of his daughter's death with mounting horror. Something was wrong. Something was terribly, dreadfully wrong. His daughter had been young and healthy. She had never suffered from fainting spells or seizures. She had been a trained nurse, for God's sake, a woman who understood medicine and physiology, a woman who would not simply drown in her own bathtub without cause. The coroner's verdict made no sense. The circumstances were too convenient. The husband who had married her so hastily and insured her so quickly was now a wealthy widower, free to disappear and begin the process again. Charles Burnham wrote letters. He contacted the police in Blackpool. He demanded a further investigation. He was dismissed as a grieving father, a man driven by loss to see conspiracies where none existed. The case was closed. The verdict had been rendered. There was nothing more to be done, but Charles Burnham did not forget. He kept his suspicions alive, nursing them through the long months that followed, waiting for evidence that might prove what he knew in his heart to be true. His daughter had not died by accident. His daughter had been murdered, and somewhere in England, the man who had killed her was walking free, planning his next crime, selecting his next victim. The Christmas of 1913 came and went. The new year dawned with its burden of hopes and fears. In distant Sarajevo, an archduke was living out his final months, unknowing of the assassin's bullet that would shatter the peace of Europe. And in the boarding houses and matrimonial columns of England, George Joseph Smith was already casting his line for another bride. The pattern was set. The method was proven. The killer was confident, perhaps overconfident in his own invincibility. He had murdered twice and escaped twice. He saw no reason why he should not murder again. The bathwater had grown cold in Blackpool. Alice Burnham lay in her grave, unmourned and unavenged, and the wheel of fate was already turning toward its final revolution. Chapter 6. The Pattern in the Water. The year 1914 dawned over England with a strange mixture of complacency and unease. The newspapers spoke of industrial unrest, of suffragette militancy, of Irish Home Rule, and the spectre of civil war in Ulster. The great powers of Europe were locked in their alliances, bristling with armies and battleships, each convinced that strength alone guaranteed peace. No one knew, no one could have known, that the summer would bring catastrophe, that the assassination of an Austrian archduke in a Balkan city would set the continent ablaze. The world balanced on the edge of the abyss, but the abyss had not yet opened, and life continued in its familiar patterns. In this atmosphere of unknowing, George Joseph Smith moved through England with the confidence of a man who had discovered an inexhaustible gold mine. He had murdered 2 women in the space of 18 months and collected nearly £3,000 in insurance and inheritance. No one suspected him, no one connected the deaths. No one saw the pattern emerging from the bathwater. The reasons for this failure of detection were numerous and instructive. England in 1914 possessed no centralised system for tracking suspicious deaths. Each coroner operated independently, rendering verdicts based solely on the evidence presented in his own court. A death in Herne Bay and a death in Blackpool were separated by 200 miles, investigated by different officials, recorded in different registers. There was no mechanism for comparing cases, no database of suspicious circumstances, no way for one coroner to know what another had concluded about a seemingly similar tragedy. Moreover, the very nature of the deaths worked in Smith's favour. Drowning in a bathtub was not in itself remarkable. The era's medical literature contained numerous accounts of such accidents, attributed variously to epileptic fits, fainting spells, heart failure, and simple carelessness. The bathtub was a relatively new fixture in English homes, and the protocols for safe bathing were not yet fully established. Hot water could cause dizziness. Enclosed spaces could produce fainting. A moment's inattention could prove fatal. Each death, considered in isolation, was entirely plausible. The victims themselves contributed to the killer's invisibility. Bessie Mundy had been estranged from her family, a lonely spinster whose death aroused no sustained inquiry. Alice Burnham's father had raised suspicions, but his voice was easily dismissed as the grief-stricken ravings of a man who could not accept that his daughter had died by accident. Neither woman had friends or advocates with the resources or determination to pursue an independent investigation. They were, in the cruel calculus of the era, disposable women, their deaths regrettable but not remarkable. And then there was the matter of George Joseph Smith himself. He was a master of disguise, not in the theatrical sense of false beards and foreign accents, but in the more subtle art of social camouflage. He appeared exactly as he wished to appear, a respectable middle-class Englishman of modest means and conventional habits. He dressed appropriately, he spoke correctly, he paid his bills on time and caused no disturbances. He was, to all outward appearances, precisely what he claimed to be. The mask never slipped in public. The monster remained hidden behind the face of the ordinary man. The police of the era were ill-equipped to detect such predators. Criminal investigation in Up 14 relied heavily on physical evidence, witnesses, and confessions. Forensic science was in its infancy. There were no techniques for analysing water in lungs, no methods for determining whether a drowning was accidental or deliberate, no way to prove that a death without visible marks of violence was actually murder. A clever killer who left no bruises, no fingerprints, no witnesses, was essentially immune to detection. George Joseph Smith was very clever indeed. As the months of 1914 unfolded, Smith continued his predatory existence. He travelled under various names, lodging in boarding houses, frequenting the social gatherings where lonely women might be found. He was patient, methodical, always assessing potential victims for their vulnerability and value. He corresponded with women who placed matrimonial advertisements, testing their responses, evaluating their circumstances, calculating their worth. He was, in his own way, a businessman conducting market research, seeking the most profitable investment for his peculiar talents. The war, when it came in August, created new opportunities and new challenges. The great conflict that would claim millions of lives and reshape the map of Europe also transformed the landscape of English society. Men marched away to the front, leaving women behind to manage households and businesses, to work in factories and offices, to assume responsibilities that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. The old certainties were crumbling, the old proprieties were loosening, and in the chaos of a nation at war, a predator could move with even greater freedom. The war also created a new population of vulnerable women, wives whose husbands had been killed or wounded, widows suddenly thrust into independence, women whose fiancés had marched away and never returned. The personal columns of the newspapers swelled with advertisements from women seeking companionship, seeking security, seeking someone to fill the void left by the catastrophe of war. For George Joseph Smith, it was a target-rich environment. But the war also brought dangers. The authorities were on heightened alert for spies and saboteurs. Strangers were viewed with suspicion. Men of military age who were not in uniform faced awkward questions about their status and occupation. Smith was 42 years old in 1914, too old for conscription, but young enough to attract attention if he seemed to be avoiding his duty. He would need to be more careful than ever, more attentive to his cover stories, more cautious in his movements. Throughout the autumn of 1914, Smith refined his approach. He had learned from his previous successes what worked and what needed improvement. The insurance policies should be taken out immediately after marriage, before the bride had time for second thoughts. The medical groundwork should be laid carefully, establishing a history of illness that would explain sudden death. The actual killing should be done quickly, efficiently, with minimal opportunity for the victim to raise an alarm, and the departure after the death should be swift, before grieving relatives or suspicious neighbours could begin asking questions. He also considered the geography of his crimes. Herne Bay and Blackpool were far apart, but both were seaside resorts with transient populations, places where strangers came and went without attracting notice. There were dozens of such towns scattered around the English coast, each offering the same combination of anonymity and opportunity. A man could move from town to town, leaving a trail of drowned brides behind him, and no one would ever connect the deaths. The method too could be refined. The bathtub drownings had worked perfectly, but there were variations to consider. The timing could be adjusted, the medical symptoms could be varied. The insurance amounts could be calibrated to maximise profit without arousing suspicion. Each crime was an experiment, a data point in an ongoing study of murder for profit. George Joseph Smith approached his work with the cold rationality of a scientist, testing hypotheses, analysing results, refining techniques. As December approached, Smith identified his next target. Her name was Margaret Elizabeth Lofty, and she lived in Bristol, working as a lady's companion, earning a modest salary that she supplemented with small savings carefully accumulated over years of service. She was 38 years old, plain but not unattractive, respectable but not wealthy. She was exactly the type of woman Smith had learned to exploit, lonely enough to be grateful for attention, desperate enough to ignore warning signs, worth enough to justify the effort of courtship and murder. The approach was standard, A matrimonial advertisement, perhaps, or a chance encounter at a social gathering. A pleasant conversation, an exchange of addresses, a correspondence that gradually became more personal, more intimate, more committed. By early December, Margaret Lofty had agreed to marry a man who called himself John Lloyd, a land agent from London who had swept her off her feet with his attentiveness and apparent devotion. The wedding was scheduled for the December 17th, 1914, at a registry office in Bath. It would be a quiet affair, witnessed by strangers, celebrated by no one. The bride would wear her best dress and carry her hopes like flowers. The groom would smile and make his vows, and calculate how soon he could collect her insurance. Margaret Elizabeth Lofty had approximately 24 hours left to live. She did not know it. She could not have known it. She was in love, and love is blind to the darkness that lurks behind familiar faces. The pattern was complete. The method was proven. The killer was ready to strike again. But this time something would go wrong. This time the pattern would be noticed. This time the waters would give up their dead, and the dead would speak with voices that demanded justice. The war raged on in Flanders. The newspapers reported casualty lists that grew longer with each passing week. And in the quiet streets of English towns, another kind of war was being waged. A war between a solitary predator and the unsuspecting women who crossed his path. The tide was about to turn. The reckoning was at hand, and George Joseph Smith, for all his cunning, had no idea that his final crime was already leading him toward the gallows. Chapter 7. The Final Victim. Margaret Elizabeth Lofty was the daughter of a clergyman, born into the comfortable respectability of the Victorian middle class. Her father had been a minister of modest means and genuine faith, serving parishes in the fierce West Country, raising his children with the stern piety that the era demanded. Margaret had grown up in rectories and vicarages, learning the lessons of duty and self-sacrifice that were considered essential for young women of her station. She had been taught to serve others, to suppress her own desires, to accept her place in the divine order of things. She had been taught above all to hope for marriage as the natural fulfillment of a woman's purpose. But marriage had not come. The years had passed, each one carrying away a little more of her youth, a little more of her hope. Her father had died. Her mother had followed. Her siblings had scattered to their own lives, their own families, their own concerns. By the time she reached her late 30s, Margaret Lofty found herself alone in the world, working as a lady's companion to elderly women who needed someone to read to them, to accompany them on outings, to provide the illusion of family to those who had none. It was respectable work, but it was not a life. It was an existence, nothing more. She lived in lodgings in Bristol, a city she had come to know during her years of service. Her rooms were modest but clean. Her routine was predictable. Morning prayers, afternoon duties, evening solitude. She attended church on Sundays, took tea with acquaintances, read improving literature, and waited for something to happen. She was not beautiful, but she was not ugly. She was not clever, but she was not stupid. She was simply ordinary, a woman of no particular distinction, passing through the world without leaving a mark. The man who called himself John Lloyd appeared in her life in early December of 1914. The precise circumstances of their meeting are unclear, but the pattern was surely familiar. A pleasant conversation, a mutual interest, an exchange of addresses. Within days they were corresponding. Within a week, he had declared his love. Within 2 weeks, he had proposed marriage. Margaret Lofty should have been suspicious. A woman of 38, with no fortune and no particular beauty, did not attract suitors by accident. A man who proposed marriage after a fortnight's acquaintance was either a fool or a fraud. The haste, the intensity, the pressure to commit before she had time to think, these were warning signs that any sensible woman should have recognised. But Margaret was not thinking sensibly. She was thinking with her heart, and her heart was desperate for love. John Lloyd was charming, he was attentive. He listened to her stories and laughed at her small jokes. and made her feel for the first time in years that she mattered to someone. He spoke of his work as a land agent, his comfortable income, his desire to settle down with a good woman and build a home. He painted pictures of the life they would share, a cottage somewhere, perhaps, with a garden and a cat and evenings spent reading by the fire. It was exactly what Margaret had always wanted, exactly what she had given up hoping for. It seemed too good to be true. It was too good to be true. She did not tell her family about the engagement. There was no one to tell, really. Her brothers were distant, her sister distracted by her own concerns, her cousins scattered across the country. She had acquaintances but no true friends, colleagues yes, but no confidants. She was, in the terrible isolation of the spinster's existence, entirely alone with her decision. There was no one to counsel caution, no one to investigate this stranger who had appeared so suddenly and pressed his suit so urgently, no one to save her from herself. The wedding took place on December 17th, 1914, at a registry office in Bath. It was a grey, cold day, the streets slick with rain, the sky heavy with clouds that threatened snow. The ceremony was brief, the vows perfunctory, the witnesses strangers recruited from the street for a shilling each. Margaret wore her best dress, a dark blue wool that she had saved for special occasions. John Lloyd wore a sober suit and an expression of appropriate solemnity. They signed the register, received their certificate, and walked out into the winter afternoon as husband and wife. They did not linger in Bath. John Lloyd had business in London, he explained, matters that required his immediate attention. They would take lodgings in the city, establish themselves properly, and then begin their new life together. Margaret agreed, as she agreed to everything her husband suggested. She was married now. Her duty was to follow where he led. They arrived in London that evening and took rooms at a boarding house in Bismarck Road, Highgate. The house was run by a Mrs. Louisa Blatch, a respectable widow who prided herself on the quality of her establishment. The room she offered the Lloyds was small but comfortable, with a gas fire, a sitting area, and access to a bathroom down the hall. The bathroom contained a cast-iron bathtub, full length, with hot and cold running water. John Lloyd examined the facilities with evident interest and pronounced them satisfactory. That night, their wedding night, Margaret Lofty experienced the intimacies of marriage for the first time in her life. What passed between them in the privacy of their room can only be imagined, but it is worth noting that George Joseph Smith was a man who had learned to perform the rituals of affection without feeling any genuine emotion. For him, the wedding night was simply another step in the process, a necessary component of the deception that would culminate in his wife's death. For Margaret, it may have been something else entirely, a moment of connection, of hope, of belief that her loneliness was finally at an end. The following morning, December 18th, John Lloyd took his wife to see a doctor. He explained that Margaret had been suffering from headaches, severe headaches that left her disoriented and unwell. The doctor, a man named Bates, examined Mrs. Lloyd and found nothing obviously wrong, but prescribed a mild sedative and advised rest. It was a familiar routine, though Dr. Bates had no way of knowing it. The medical groundwork was being laid for another accidental death. That evening, Margaret Lloyd decided to take a bath. The day had been tiring, the journey from Bath exhausting, and she longed for the comfort of warm water and solitude. Her husband encouraged the idea. He would go out, he said, and fetch something for their supper. She should take her time, enjoy her bath, relax after the exertions of the past few days. It was the last conversation they would ever have. Margaret undressed and lowered herself into the tub. The water was warm, the room quiet, the boarding house settling into its evening routines. She lay back and closed her eyes, letting the tension drain from her body. She was married. She had a husband who loved her. Tomorrow she would begin her new life. Everything was going to be different now. Everything was going to be better. She did not hear the door open. She did not hear her husband enter the bathroom with silent steps. She did not see the pale eyes that watched her with cold calculation, assessing the position of her body, the depth of the water, the best angle of attack. The hands that seized her ankles were strong and sudden. Her legs were lifted. Her body slid down the back of the tub. Her head plunged beneath the surface before she could scream, before she could struggle, before she could understand what was happening. Water flooded her nose and mouth. Her arms flailed uselessly against the slippery sides of the tub. She tried to sit up, but the leverage was impossible. The hands held her legs aloft, her body bent at an unnatural angle, her face submerged in water that had been warm and soothing only moments before. It was over quickly. The thrashing ceased. The body went limp. The last bubbles rose to the surface and burst in the silence. George Joseph Smith lowered his wife's legs back into the water and arranged her body in a position consistent with accidental drowning. He checked her pulse. He straightened his clothing. He composed his features, and then he went downstairs to inform the landlady that his wife had suffered an accident. Mrs. Blatch was in the kitchen when Mr. Lloyd appeared, his face pale, his voice trembling. His wife, he said, had fainted in her bath. She was not breathing. He needed help. He needed a doctor. He needed someone, anyone, to tell him what to do. Dr. Bates was summoned for the second time that day. He arrived to find Margaret Lloyd's body lying on the bathroom floor, where her husband and the landlady had dragged it from the tub. She was dead, beyond any possibility of revival. The doctor examined her and found no signs of violence, no marks of struggle, no indication of anything other than a tragic accident. The headaches he had heard about that morning, the sedative he had prescribed, perhaps she had fainted, slipped beneath the water, drowned before she could recover. It was a terrible tragedy, but not an inexplicable one. The coroner would surely reach the same conclusion. Margaret Elizabeth Lofty had been married for exactly 1 day. She had been a wife for approximately 32 hours. She had trusted a man who saw her only as a source of profit, loved a man who was incapable of love, given herself to a man who repaid her devotion with murder, and now she was dead, her body cooling on a bathroom floor in Highgate, her dreams extinguished, her hopes drowned in 6 inches of bathwater. George Joseph Smith had killed again. The pattern held, the method worked, the profits were assured. But this time something was different. This time the coincidence would be noticed. This time the pattern would emerge from the water, like a drowned corpse rising to accuse its murderer. The reckoning was at hand, the net was closing. And George Joseph Smith, for all his cunning, had finally made the mistake that would send him to the gallows. The night deepened over London. The gas lamps flickered in the fog. And somewhere in the darkness, justice was waking from its long sleep. Chapter 8. The News of the World. The body of Margaret Elizabeth Lloyd was removed from the boarding house in Bismarck Road on the morning of December the 19th, 1914. The coroner's officer made his notes, the undertaker made his arrangements, and the machinery of death proceeded along its familiar tracks. An inquest would be held, a verdict would be rendered, a widow would be buried. Life would continue for everyone except the woman who had drowned in her bath on her wedding night. George Joseph Smith played his part with practiced conviction. He wept at appropriate moments. He trembled with apparent shock. He answered questions in a broken voice, describing how he had returned from an errand to find his wife submerged in the tub, how he had pulled her from the water and attempted to revive her, how he had realized with horror that she was beyond help. The performance was flawless. The grief appeared genuine. No one who witnessed it had any reason to doubt that John Lloyd was exactly what he claimed to be, a devastated husband, a victim of cruel fate, a man whose happiness had been snatched away on the very threshold of married life. The inquest was held on December the 21st, 3 days after Margaret's death. The coroner heard testimony from the landlady, the doctor, and the grieving widower. The evidence pointed clearly toward accidental death. Mrs. Lloyd had suffered from headaches. She had been prescribed a sedative. She had fainted in her bath, slipped beneath the water, and drowned before anyone could help her. It was a tragedy, but not a mystery. The verdict was returned without hesitation. Death by misadventure. George Joseph Smith collected his wife's modest savings and began the process of claiming her life insurance. The paperwork was tedious but straightforward. Within weeks, he expected to receive several £100s. enough to sustain him comfortably while he planned his next venture. He had done it 3 times now, and 3 times he had escaped without suspicion. The method was proven. The system worked. There was no reason to believe that this time would be any different. But 200 miles away in the Lancashire town of Blackpool, a woman named Margaret Crossley was reading her Sunday newspaper with mounting unease. Mrs. Crossley was the landlady of the boarding house on Cocker Street where Alice Burnham had drowned in her bath almost exactly 1 year earlier. She had never forgotten the tragedy, so never stopped wondering about the strange circumstances of that December night. The husband who had seemed so calm, so controlled, even as his wife's body lay cooling upstairs. The insurance policy taken out only days before the death. The haste with which Mr. Smith had departed after the funeral, leaving behind no forwarding address, vanishing as if he had never existed. The newspaper she held in her hands was the News of the World, a popular Sunday publication that specialised in crime, scandal, and sensational stories. The edition of January the 3rd, 1915, contained a brief item about a woman who had drowned in her bath in Highgate, London. The circumstances were eerily familiar. A recent marriage, a new husband, a death on the wedding night. Mrs. Crossley read the article twice, her hands trembling slightly. Then she set down the paper and began to compose a letter to the police. She was not the only one who noticed the coincidence. In the village of Aston Clinton, in Buckinghamshire, Charles Burnham was reading the same newspaper with the same growing horror. His daughter Alice had drowned in her bath in Blackpool, married to a man named George Smith. Now another woman had drowned in her bath in London, married to a man named John Lloyd. The names were different, but the pattern was identical. Charles Burnham had never believed that his daughter's death was an accident. Now he had evidence that he was right. He too wrote to the police, pouring out his suspicions in urgent, desperate prose. His daughter had been murdered. He was certain of it. The man who had killed her was still at large, still preying on vulnerable women, still claiming victims. Something had to be done. Someone had to listen. Justice had to be served. The letters arrived at Scotland Yard within days of each other. They landed on the desk of Detective Inspector Arthur Neal, a veteran investigator with a reputation for methodical thoroughness. Neal read the letters carefully, noting the similarities between the cases, the parallel circumstances, the suspicious coincidences. 2 women drowned in their baths, 2 recent marriages, 2 husbands who had disappeared after collecting insurance money. It was either an extraordinary coincidence or evidence of something far more sinister. Neal began his investigation by requesting the files on both deaths. The Blackpool case was straightforward. Alice Burnham, née Smith, drowned in her bath on December the 12th, 1913. Verdict of accidental death. The Highgate case was equally clear. Margaret Lloyd, née Lofty, drowned in her bath on December 18th, 1914. Verdict of accidental death. The verdicts had been rendered by different coroners in different jurisdictions, each working independently, each unaware of the other case. There had been no reason to connect them. Until now. Neal studied the descriptions of the 2 husbands. George Smith of Blackpool, medium height, thick moustache, pale eyes, confident manner. John Lloyd of Highgate, medium height, thick moustache, pale eyes, confident manner. The physical descriptions were virtually identical. The behavioural patterns were the same. The timing of the marriages, the insurance policies, the medical consultations about headaches and fits, everything matched with uncanny precision. The detective began to dig deeper. He sent inquiries to police forces across England, asking for any similar cases. Women drowned in baths, recent marriages, suspicious circumstances. The responses trickled in over the following weeks, each one adding another piece to the puzzle. And then, from the coastal town of Herne Bay in Kent, came the report that would break the case wide open. Bessie Mundy, née Williams, had drowned in her bath on July 13th, 1912. She had been married to a man named Henry Williams, who had collected her substantial inheritance and life insurance before vanishing without a trace. The description of Henry Williams matched the descriptions of George Smith and John Lloyd. The circumstances of the death matched the circumstances of Alice Burnham's death and Margaret Lloyd's death. 3 women, 3 bathtub drownings, 3 husbands who appeared to be the same man. Detective Inspector Neal now had enough evidence to justify a full-scale investigation. He assembled a team of officers and began the painstaking work of tracing the movements of the man behind the murders. The task was complicated by the multiple aliases, the constant relocations, the deliberate efforts to avoid leaving a trail. But the detective was patient and thorough, and gradually the pieces began to fall into place. The breakthrough came when Neal located a photograph of the man who had married Bessie Mundy. It had been taken at a seaside studio in Herne Bay, a formal portrait of a newly married couple, the husband standing stiffly behind his seated wife. Neal showed the photograph to witnesses from the Blackpool and Highgate cases. The identifications were immediate and certain. George Smith, Henry Williams and John Lloyd were all the same man. His real name, the detective discovered, was George Joseph Smith. He had a criminal record dating back to childhood, a history of fraud and theft and bigamous marriages. He was currently living in London under the name John Lloyd, apparently unconcerned about the possibility of detection, confident that his crimes would never be connected, that the pattern would never be seen. On February 1st and 15, Detective Inspector Neal obtained a warrant for the arrest of George Joseph Smith on suspicion of murder. The charge was based on the death of Margaret Lloyd, but the investigation had already uncovered evidence linking Smith to the deaths of Bessie Mundy and Alice Burnham as well. If the evidence held, Smith would face trial for 3 murders, the largest serial killing case England had seen in years. The arrest took place without drama. Smith was found at lodgings in Shepherd's Bush, living comfortably on the proceeds of his latest crime. When the police arrived, he seemed more annoyed than alarmed, as if the interruption were merely an inconvenience rather than the beginning of the end. He denied everything, of course. He had never murdered anyone. The deaths were accidents, tragic coincidences, nothing more. The police were persecuting an innocent man, but the evidence was overwhelming, and George Joseph Smith must have known, even as he proclaimed his innocence, that his luck had finally run out. The pattern had been seen, the connections had been made, the waters had given up their and the dead were crying out for justice. The news of the arrest spread quickly through the newspapers. The case was a sensation, combining murder, bigamy, insurance fraud, and the gruesome details of women drowned in their baths. The public was fascinated and horrified in equal measure. Here was a monster who had preyed on lonely women, who had exploited their desperation for love, who had murdered them for profit with cold, calculated efficiency. Here was a predator who had hidden behind the mask of respectability, who had moved through English society undetected, who had claimed victim after victim, while the authorities remained oblivious. The trial would be one of the most famous in English legal history. The prosecution would assemble an unprecedented array of evidence. The defence would argue coincidence and reasonable doubt, and at the centre of it all would stand George Joseph Smith, the man of many names, the bride in the bath murderer, facing judgment at last for the crimes that had haunted the waterways of England. The net had closed. The reckoning had come, and in the cells beneath the Old Bailey, a killer waited to learn whether he would live or die. Chapter 9. The Trial at the Old Bailey. The summer of 1915 was a season of death. In the fields of Flanders and Gallipoli, young men were dying by the tens of thousands, their bodies torn apart by artillery and machine gun fire, their graves marked by simple wooden crosses that stretched to the horizon. The newspapers published casualty lists that filled entire pages, column after column of names, each one representing a life cut short, a family shattered, a future destroyed. England was learning the true cost of modern warfare, and the lesson was written in blood. Against this backdrop of unprecedented carnage, the trial of George Joseph Smith might have seemed a small thing, a domestic tragedy dwarfed by the industrial slaughter of the Western Front. But the public's appetite for sensation was, if anything, sharpened by the horrors of war. The newspapers devoted extensive coverage to the proceedings, offering their readers a respite from the grimness of the military dispatches, a murder case that could be comprehended and resolved, a villain who could be identified and punished. In a world gone mad with violence, the trial of the Brides and the Bath murderer offered the consolation of justice. The proceedings began on June 22, 1915, at the Central Criminal Court, known universally as the Old Bailey. The building itself was a monument to Victorian confidence in the rule of law, its grand facade dominated by a bronze statue of Justice holding her scales and sword. Inside, the courtroom was crowded with spectators, journalists and legal professionals, all eager to witness the most sensational trial of the year. The presiding judge was Mr. Justice Scrutton, a man of formidable reputation and stern demeanour. The prosecution was led by Archibald Bodkin, one of the most skilled advocates of his generation, assisted by a team of junior counsel. The defence was in the hands of Edward Marshall Hall, a legendary barrister whose theatrical style and passionate advocacy had saved many a client from the gallows. If anyone could secure an acquittal for George Joseph Smith, it was Marshall Hall. The accused sat in the dock, watching the proceedings with an expression that observers described as detached, almost bored. He had pleaded not guilty to all charges, maintaining that the deaths of his wives were tragic accidents, that he was the victim of coincidence and persecution, that the prosecution's case was built on speculation and prejudice. His confidence seemed unshakable, even as the evidence against him mounted. The prosecution's strategy was built on a simple but powerful premise. The pattern proved the crime. 3 women had drowned in their baths under virtually identical circumstances. Each had recently married. Each had been insured. Each had been taken to doctors with complaints of headaches or fits shortly before her death. Each had died while her husband was conveniently absent from the scene. The odds against such a pattern occurring by chance were astronomical. The only reasonable explanation was murder. But proving murder was not straightforward. There were no witnesses to the actual killings. There was no physical evidence of violence on any of the bodies. There was no confession, no accomplice, no documentary proof of intent. The prosecution had to convince the jury that the circumstantial evidence was overwhelming, that the pattern itself constituted proof beyond reasonable doubt. The first days of the trial were devoted to establishing the facts of the 3 deaths. Witness after witness took the stand. Landladies who had rented rooms to Smith and his victims, doctors who had examined the women before their deaths, police officers who had investigated the cases. The testimony was dry, detailed, and damning. The pattern emerged with terrible clarity. The same man, the same method, the same result, repeated 3 times over a period of 3 years. The defence countered with the arguments about coincidence and reasonable doubt. Marshall Hall pointed out that drowning in a bathtub was not in itself unusual. Medical literature documented numerous cases of such accidents, attributed to epilepsy, fainting, heart failure, and other natural causes. The prosecution had not proven that any of the deaths was murder. They had merely shown that 3 women had died in similar circumstances, which might be tragic but was not necessarily criminal. The turning point came when the prosecution called its expert witness, a pathologist named Bernard Spilsbury. Spilsbury was already famous for his work on other cases, a meticulous scientist whose testimony carried enormous weight with juries. He had examined the evidence from all 3 deaths and conducted experiments to determine how the drownings might have occurred. Spilsbury's testimony was devastating. He explained that a woman lying in a full-length bathtub was in an extremely vulnerable position. If her feet were suddenly seized and lifted, her body would slide down the inclined back of the tub, plunging her head beneath the water. The shock of sudden immersion would trigger an involuntary gasp, drawing water into the lungs. The victim would lose consciousness within seconds, far too quickly to offer effective resistance. Death would follow within minutes, leaving no marks, no bruises, no evidence of the violence that had occurred. To demonstrate his theory, Spilsbury had arranged for experiments using professional divers in bathtubs. The results were conclusive. A person whose legs were suddenly lifted while lying in a full tub would be rendered helpless almost instantly. The method was simple, quick, and virtually undetectable. It was, Spilsbury concluded, the perfect technique for murder. The defence challenged Spilsbury's conclusions, arguing that the experiments were not conducted under realistic conditions, that the divers were prepared for what would happen, that the results could not be applied to the actual deaths. But the damage was done. The jury had heard a plausible explanation for how George Joseph Smith had murdered his wives without leaving a trace. The pattern now had a mechanism, and the mechanism was murder. The prosecution called further witnesses to establish Smith's character and history. Former victims of his frauds testified about his methods of deception, his ability to charm and manipulate, his utter lack of conscience. The story of Caroline Thornhill, his first wife, was recounted in detail. How he had forced her to work and surrender her wages, how he had abandoned her, how he had her arrested for theft when she tried to escape. The portrait that emerged was of a man utterly devoid of human feeling, a predator who saw other people only as sources of profit. Smith himself did not testify. Marshal Hall advised him that his manner would not impress the jury, that his coldness would be interpreted as guilt, that he was better served by silence than by self-incrimination. It was sound advice, but it left the prosecution's narrative unchallenged. The jury heard only one side of the story, and that side painted George Joseph Smith as a monster. The closing arguments were masterpieces of forensic oratory. Archibald Bodkin summarised the evidence with clinical precision, walking the jury through the pattern of deaths, the identical methods, the financial motives, the lies and deceptions. He argued that the evidence was overwhelming, that no reasonable person could believe that 3 women had accidentally drowned in their baths under such similar circumstances, that the only verdict consistent with the facts was guilty. Marshal Hall made an impassioned plea for reasonable doubt. He reminded the jury that they were being asked to send a man to his death, that the burden of proof lay with the prosecution, that circumstantial evidence alone should not suffice for a conviction. He challenged Spilsbury's conclusions, questioned the reliability of the witnesses, urged the jury to consider the possibility, however remote, that George Joseph Smith was telling the truth. But the jury was not persuaded. After retiring for only 22 minutes, they returned with their verdict, guilty of murder. George Joseph Smith received the news without visible emotion, his face as blank and cold as it had been throughout the trial. When the judge pronounced the sentence of death, Smith finally spoke, declaring that he was innocent, that he had been wronged, that the verdict was a travesty of justice. His protests were ignored. The sentence stood. The appeal was heard in July and rejected. The Home Secretary declined to recommend clemency. George Joseph Smith would hang for his crimes, the first serial killer of the 20th century to be executed in England. The trial was over. Justice had been served, but the ripples of the case would spread far beyond the courtroom, influencing forensic science, criminal investigation, and the public understanding of murder for generations to come. The brides in the bath had been avenged. The waters had given up their dead, and in a cell at Maidstone Prison, a killer counted the days until his appointment with the hangman. Chapter 10. The Gallows at Maidstone. The summer faded into autumn, and the war ground on. In the trenches of France, men fought and died for yards of mud that would be lost and won and lost again in the endless cycle of attrition. At sea, German submarines prowled the shipping lanes, sending vessels to the bottom with their cargoes of food and munitions. On the home front, the casualty list continued to grow, each name a wound in the fabric of the English society. George Joseph Smith spent these months in the condemned cell at Maidstone Prison, awaiting the execution that had been scheduled for August 13th, 1915. The cell was small and spare, furnished with a bed, a chair, a table, and little else. A guard watched him constantly, day and night, ensuring that he did not cheat the hangman by taking his own life. He was allowed visitors, but few came. He was permitted to write letters, but none survive. He existed in a limbo between life and death, waiting for the morning when the door would open and the final walk would begin. The condemned man showed little sign of remorse or reflection during these final weeks. he continued to maintain his innocence, insisting to anyone who would listen that he had been wrongly convicted, that the deaths of his wives were accidents, that the jury had been deceived by prejudice and circumstantial evidence. Whether he believed his own denials or was simply incapable of facing the truth, none who observed him could say. George Joseph Smith had spent his entire adult life constructing false identities and telling lies. Perhaps, in the end, he could no longer distinguish between the fiction and the reality. The prison chaplain visited regularly, offering spiritual counsel and the consolations of religion. Smith received these ministrations with apparent indifference, neither accepting nor rejecting the possibility of divine mercy. He had been raised in the nominal Christianity of the Victorian working class, but there is no evidence that faith had ever meant anything to him. The God of judgment and forgiveness was as foreign to his nature as the concepts themselves. He faced death as he had faced life, alone, unmoved, impenetrable. His legal team made a final attempt to save him, petitioning the Home Secretary for a reprieve on grounds that the evidence had been insufficient, that the trial had been unfair, that new information might emerge to exonerate him. The petition was denied. The Home Secretary saw no reason to disturb the verdict or the sentence. George Joseph Smith would hang as scheduled. The executioner assigned to the case was John Ellis, a barber from Rochdale, who had taken up the profession of hangman some 14 years earlier. Ellis was a methodical man who approached his work with professional detachment, calculating the drop required to ensure instantaneous death, testing his equipment with sandbags, rehearsing the procedure until every movement was automatic. He had executed dozens of men and women over the years, and he would execute dozens more before his own troubled end. George Joseph Smith was simply another job, another name in the ledger, another appointment to be kept. The night before the execution was quiet. Smith ate his final meal without apparent appetite, declined the offer of alcohol or sedatives, and retired to his bed at the usual hour. Whether he slept or lay awake in the darkness, contemplating the void that awaited him, no record tells. The guards watched in silence. The hours crept past, and slowly, imperceptibly, the sky beyond the prison walls began to lighten with the approach of dawn. The morning of August 13th, 1915, was warm and overcast, the sun hidden behind a blanket of grey clouds. At Maidstone Prison, the machinery of execution was set in motion. The scaffold had been erected in a small building adjacent to the condemned cell, a purpose-built structure designed for efficient dispatch. The trapdoors had been tested. The rope had been measured and adjusted. Everything was ready. At 8 o'clock, the execution party assembled outside Smith's cell. John Ellis was there, calm and professional in his dark suit. The prison governor was there, representing the authority of the state. The chaplain was there, ready to offer final prayers. 2 warders were there, prepared to assist if the condemned man resisted or collapsed. The door was unlocked, and if they entered, George Joseph Smith rose to meet them. He had dressed carefully in the clothes provided by the prison, a plain suit without collar or tie. His face was pale but composed, his manner controlled. If he felt fear, he did not show it. If he wished to speak, to confess, to beg for mercy, he gave no sign. He simply stood and waited for what would come. The procedure was swift and practiced. Smith's hands were pinioned behind his back with a leather strap. He was led from the cell through a door that opened directly onto the scaffold, a distance of perhaps 20 feet. The chaplain walked beside him, reciting prayers in a low voice. The other members of the party followed close behind, ready to act if anything went wrong. The scaffold itself was a simple structure, a raised platform with a trapdoor in the centre, a beam overhead from which the rope hung, a lever that would release the trap when pulled. Smith was positioned on the trapdoor, his feet placed precisely on the marked spot. The noose was placed around his neck and adjusted so that the knot sat beneath his left ear. A white hood was drawn over his head, obscuring his features, sparing the witnesses the sight of his final expression. The chaplain's voice continued, speaking words of faith and hope that may or may not have reached the ears of the condemned man. The final seconds ticked away. John Ellis stepped to the lever, paused for a heartbeat, and pulled. The trapdoor fell open. George Joseph Smith dropped through the gap, the rope snapping taut, his body jerking once and then hanging still. The drop had been calculated correctly. Death was instantaneous, the neck broken cleanly, the end swift and certain. The bride's in the bath murderer was dead. The body was left hanging for the customary hour before being cut down and examined by the prison doctor. Death was officially certified, the cause recorded as judicial hanging. The remains were buried within the prison walls, in an unmarked grave, without ceremony or mourning. No family claimed him. No monument marked his passing. George Joseph Smith vanished into the earth as thoroughly as he had tried to make his victims vanish into the water. The news of the execution was reported briefly in the newspapers, a small item competing for attention with the latest dispatches from the front. The public had already moved on to new sensations, new horrors, new outrages. The war demanded all the attention that could be spared from the business of daily survival. The brides in the bath were already fading into memory, their stories becoming legend, their killer becoming a cautionary tale told to frighten the credulous. But the case left its mark on the world in ways that outlasted the fleeting interest of the newspapers. The trial of George Joseph Smith established important precedents in English law, particularly regarding the admissibility of similar fact evidence, the pattern of behaviour that could be used to prove criminal intent. Bernard Spilsbury's testimony about the mechanics of bathtub drowning became a landmark in forensic pathology, demonstrating how scientific reasoning could be applied to cases where physical evidence was lacking. The investigation conducted by Detective Inspector Neal became a model for coordinated police work across multiple jurisdictions. And in the broader cultural imagination, the brides in the bath murderer became an archetype, a symbol of the predator who hides behind a mask of respectability, who exploits the loneliness and desperation of vulnerable women, who murders for profit with cold efficiency. George Joseph Smith was not the first such killer, nor would he be the last. But his case brought the phenomenon into public consciousness, warning future generations that the monster might wear a pleasant face, that evil might speak with a charming voice, that death might come disguised as love. The waters of England have grown quiet now. The boarding houses and bathtubs of the Edwardian era have passed into history, replaced by modern conveniences and modern dangers, but the story of the brides in the bath endures, whispered in the darkness, remembered in the chronicles of crime, a tale of trust betrayed and justice delayed, but finally served. Bessie Mundy sleeps in her unmarked grave at Herne Bay. Alice Burnham lies in the soil of Blackpool. Margaret Lofty rests somewhere in the vastness of London cemeteries. They were ordinary women who wanted only what everyone wants: love, security, a life worth living. They trusted the wrong man, and they paid with their lives. But they are not forgotten. Their names survive in the records of the court, in the pages of the newspapers, in the memory of those who tell their story. They speak to us across the years, reminding us that the past is never truly past, that the dead have voices if we choose to listen, that the waters eventually give up their secrets. The candle has burned low, the night has grown deep, and somewhere in the stillness between one breath and the next, the waters whisper their final lullaby. Sleep now. The story is done, the bedside historian bids you good night.